Here's a quote from Oscar Wilde. So witty, we know. There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. This is almost paradoxical in the statement that there's seeming contradictions that provide a truth if we spend some time with it. This is exactly the kind of thing that we want our students to be able to look at and understand. Hey, yeah, there's some contradiction there, but there's something to this. So I'd like you to take just a moment and drop in the chat. What to you is complicated or sophisticated about this? And what ideas come to mind? So please go ahead and drop in the chat. I look forward to seeing your ideas here. All right, I see lots of things coming in here. As you post yours, go ahead and look at what everyone else is posting too. Okay, so take another 10 or 15 seconds and look at what everyone else has posted here. I've got a couple of people I want to come back to, and I'm going to ask to come off mute and explain. And I am going to push back on you, just like I do my students. Please do not take this as me questioning your professionalism or your knowledge of English. This is just part of the discussion, with me as kind of the moderator, mediator of the discussion, if you will. So first, I'm going to start with my friend. I like to pick on my friends, Luis Garza. So Luis and my colleague, Rebecca, will take you off of mute. Luis, you see a dichotomy. Absolutely. I'm asking you, Luis, what ideas or concepts are dichotomous here? What ideas are on opposite ends of this spectrum?
Hi. Well, the two things that I see here is basically what he's saying there. It's like you, I'm sorry. The tragedies is that you get what you want and you don't get what you want. So there's this dichotomous atmosphere that's being created between those two things that are in opposition to each other.
Right. So could I use, and Luis, is it fair for me to use the terms success and failure?
Sure.
Okay. So we have success and we have failure. Both of those things, we see them as a dichotomy, like two opposite things. But here he's calling them both a tragedy. They're both happening, and regardless of what happens, it's tragic. So now I'm going to call on someone I don't know. And so this could go terribly wrong, but I don't think it will. Ain Nice, I think. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize. I'm going to ask my colleague Rebecca to take you off of mute. And you state very frankly that it is a paradox. Absolutely. I think what you have to say, though, might build on what Luis just offered. So go ahead.
Hi, it's Ann Nice. Basically, it goes to what both of you are saying, that there is success and there is failure, yet ironically, they can both be tragic. So I think it's the unexpected nature of that it's multifaceted, meaning it isn't just one way. You can be a success, yet that can be a sad thing. And you can be a failure, and that's more expected to be a sad thing. So it's almost equating two opposites.
All right. Thank you for that. And that was an excellent pronunciation, excellent description of how you see these things working within paradox, which encompassed what Luis had to say. And thank you for correcting me on the pronunciation of your name.
No.
I would like to hear from Heather Brumley. And it says a rich and complex understanding of the topic. And Heather, which topic? Tragedy, success, failure? What are you thinking?
I think it is more of being self-aware.
Say more.
Of knowing what it is that we really want, because sometimes we think we know what we want and we don't. And the opposite is often what we really need.
Mhm. Thank you very much for that. So thank you to all of you who offered this. And we've gotten some more comments in the chat there that are things building off of what some of you just offered. But I want to point out something that all of us just did. And we could keep going with this and get some brilliant things. I know we could. But I heard people using the word paradoxical very comfortably. We're English majors, most of us, we're English teachers, we're people in this world. And so this is how our brain works. You hear this a lot from me if you kind of attend my sessions or my APSIs. Also, I heard people using the word ironically, and us understanding that, us getting that, and talking about a dichotomy. I mean, very much we see that dichotomous. And this is not to say that complex or sophisticated things are always just simply dichotomous. It's almost ironic to say simply dichotomous in this context, but stay with me. It's not always to say that there's a binary. There's usually not. I think it was Anne that used the term multifaceted, which in itself is a metaphor coming from jewelry to talk about the different faces of an idea, the different parts of an idea, how they all come together to make one thing that shines, one beautiful thing, or to draw out the beauty of something. Okay. This is something that all of us are usually pretty good at. We can navigate these things. Our students, however, struggle with it, and we know they do, a lot of them. Even the most brilliant students, these things are so frustrating. And the students that I encounter that get the most frustrated with it are the straight A students who have always known the answers. They struggle to see the beauty and the ambiguity or the uncertainty of some of these ideas. And we really need to train their thinking to be more comfortable with that. So this is very much about training thinking as they read, thinking as they write. We'll look at that a little bit more as we move on, and we will leave here with a little bit of examination of how we can get students to start doing those sorts of things. All right. So go ahead and take just a second as we, before I move on here, you've got some more ideas in the chat. I want to make sure that you see what your colleagues and peers are offering here. Tammy, I like what you said there, Tammy King, about it reminds me of saying, careful what you wish for, you might just get it. Right. I think that is a very, very similar concept, right? And then Kristen, thank you so much for offering this this character comment. This reminds me of how I teach character complexity. A character is blank and blank or blank yet blank. I love that, working with those conjunctions, because all conjunctions do is signal relationships between ideas. And so I love it. Love it, love it, love it. All right. So let's go a little bit further.